The more sources of high quality information that governments have in order to be able to evaluate how they're impacting on the broader economy, the better. Certainly in terms of reporting on financial sustainability of government activities, that is very important because the decisions that are made by politicians today will certainly have long-term consequences. It's important to understand whether future inflows, mainly through taxation but other sources of income, those will balance the outflows going forwards. And very often what you find is that a relatively small policy change today can have quite big consequences in terms of financial sustainability going forwards. So having a clear, firm, audited balance sheet to start off with and to base those projections on the accrual-based IPSASB give you, and then providing those forward projections is very important. And we've issued Recommended Practice Guideline 1, which gives guidance on that. Experience that I had in my previous work in the United Kingdom during the transition from cash to accrual accounting and then accrual budgeting, you do need accounting skills in terms of initially the implementation of accrual accounting and then accrual budgeting, because you get a much richer data set on organisations' activities, and you need different skills to just dealing with cash. The challenge is, how do you actually develop those skills? Do you actually train people within government? Do you buy skills in? How do you actually deliver the increased capacity? Certainly in the UK, we did need to train more accountants. You certainly need to upskill the finance function. Then the question is actually, how do you get the broader organisation using the accrual information? So you need to not necessarily have qualified accountants throughout the organisation, but you certainly need the organisation to understand the potential gains and the sorts of information that the accountants can provide. So then what that does is actually mean that the accountants don't just need technical skills, they actually need to understand how they can work with the rest of the organisation and influence that organisation. To actually get the power of accrual properly delivered within the organisation, you need qualified and experienced chief financial officers at board level within government entities, because it's not just about preparing the information, it's actually ensuring that the information is used in all the key decisions made in the organisation. So that is really one of the key ways in which the use of accrual information can be embedded. And it certainly has helped if you actually move to accrual budgeting as well as to accrual reporting, because then that becomes the way in which the organisation is actually managed, and then people actually see the value that qualified accountants can add within their organisation. That generates the demand. But it's not something that happens overnight. Certainly, that's been a journey within the UK, and it's an ongoing journey actually in terms of encouraging organisations to use the accrual information to its full capacity. In terms of using accrual information, if you like, you kind of start off within government, and certainly one of the things that we've been working on over a period is actually getting accrual information used for government finance statistics, because it's those government finance statistics that are very often used for macroeconomic decision making within governments. Also, if the information could be used for accrual budgeting, then it has a real impact within government. You then look at the broader group of stakeholders around government finance, and then the question is not just who uses information within government, how that's portrayed externally, so in terms of accountability to civil society and so on. There has been debate about whether you need to move to accrual reporting before you do integrated reporting, or whether you can start to develop that in parallel with the implementation of accrual reporting. And opinions are actually divided. Some people say, actually, yes, it's important to bring in integrated reporting early. Other people would say, well, actually, that could be a distraction from the implementation of accrual reporting. I think it very much depends on the individual jurisdiction. But when you think about what integrated reporting is actually about in terms of broader resources, not just finance, but in terms of the human capital relationship, the way that the government works with its partners and so on. I think understanding those is very important, not just for reporting purposes, but also in terms of thinking about how the government is managing its finances, how it's governed, and all of those are very important then in terms of making sure that actually the government is actually delivering the outcomes which are important for the people in that jurisdiction. So I think you need to bring those things together, and those linkages, integrated reporting and thinking governance are all important then in terms of strong public financial management. That needs to come together then in terms of delivering the right outputs and outcomes for that jurisdiction. So they need to be looked at together as part of a holistic framework rather than something separate. And therefore, I think you can actually bring in integrated thinking, integrated reporting, whilst you're on a cash basis. I think that is more limited than having full accrual information, but I wouldn't necessarily see them as mutually exclusive. One of the key areas then is encouraging external bodies to demand that data, and that's where I think ratings agencies have a really important role to play, because there is a very big level of government bonds traded on the stock markets around the world, and yet they still don't demand the same basic information set that they would of a corporate organisation. If you want to trade on a stock exchange, you have to provide audited accrual information going back several years. That's not asked of government. So I think that's where we're trying to work with various organisations who work with ratings agencies, really, so they start to understand what they're missing out on at the moment. And I think, if the sovereign debt crisis showed us nothing else, it's that not all governments are equally creditworthy, and surely that must be information that is valuable to them in terms of pricing government bonds and so on. So I think it's raising that awareness, raising awareness of the fact that there is research that shows that if governments are more transparent, that tends to be correlated with lower levels of debt, also correlated with lower levels of borrowing costs. So there's a lot of very positive reasons why you should publish accrual-based financial statements, but what we really want to do is make sure that those are used to the maximum impact, not only by ratings agencies, but by civil society groups for accountability purposes, parliaments and so on. It's all part of the same drive. It's still a relatively new concept for governments. It's still maybe only 25 years or so ago that New Zealand published the first government consolidated financial statements. And inevitably it takes the time for ideas to develop. Even during, say, the later 1990s, it was still only a relatively few governments that were actually publishing accrual-based financial statements. There weren't standards. The standards program, the IPSASB standards program, has only been going for about 20 years. So inevitably it takes the time to actually build. And I think what you're seeing at the moment is, over the next few years, really a step change in the number of governments that actually are reporting on accrual. The figures that were published by the International Federation of Accountants and Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy in the form of the Public Sector Financial Accountability Index showed that 25% of governments are actually publishing accrual-based accounts at the moment, but within the next 5 years we expect that to rise to 65%. So a major change coming through there. And the important thing is that that's not just something that's happened in Australia and New Zealand, it's happening around the world. So you've got governments in Latin America. The majority of governments in Latin America expect to move to accrual-based reporting in the next 10 years. In the next year or so, we expect Chile and Colombia to be the first governments that publish IPSASB-based statements in terms of Latin America, with other countries following on after that. You've got countries like Tanzania in Africa publishing accrual-based statements already, and similarly you've got countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia, Philippines and so on in Asia, either publishing accrual-based statements now based on IPSAS, or they will be doing in the next few years. So this change is actually happening around the world, and I think that's really important in terms of actually pushing the change further, because really it's very important that governments actually learn from each other, and so it's not just those who are maybe in a Westminster-based system in terms of their public financial management. You need jurisdictions that come from other different traditions to make the change, and that's what we're actually seeing over the coming years. It's a realisation that the approaches to public financial management cannot realise their full potential without accrual-based information. So it's one of those things that as you start to get governments producing the information, that people begin to realise the benefits. And I think one of the issues is actually that perhaps there hasn't been as much coordination as there might have been in the past. That's certainly the drive as part of the strategy that IPSASB approved at its meeting in KL, is that we should work in partnership with other regional and international organisations, multilateral donor bodies, to promote a more joined-up approach to improving public financial management, and really promoting that idea that accrual-based reporting is a key part of that reform process. In any jurisdiction, you see that a number of different actors have to work together in order to make the change successful. So IPSASB on its own can certainly help in terms of the promotion. We can provide guidance on the implementation of specific standards, but ultimately the decision has to be taken by the politicians in that jurisdiction. That's where accountants general, auditors general become very important, and the professional bodies like MIA are also very important in terms of making that argument, in terms of providing the training and so on. And then ultimately the reforms need to be supported, because this is a process that will take a number of years. Systems changes, training and so on will need to be provided, and so there is an investment required. If there is external funding, then that actually is an important ingredient. So you need all of those really coming together, and I think that's where we're just really articulating we need to work together. We need more of a regional strategy, so we're working with partner organisations and planning to do more of that over the future years, really just to raise the profile, get better information and get a dialogue amongst the jurisdictions as to what works well, what their learning points have been, so that everybody really shares the benefits of the investment.